Today we've got a crazy revenge story on an awful mom. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, being the worst boss ever does not pay off. In the year 2003, the company I was working for closed down, so I sought out new employment. I was a machinist by trade with a great reputation, so it took me less than a day to get a job. We'll call the new place Spiral because of the specialized tools they made. Anyway, I started out as one of the operators. The place was owner-operated, meaning the owner was there daily. He had a floor supervisor that was actually pretty nice. After I'd been there around a year, the owner and super had a falling out and the super left. For whatever reason, the owner, we'll call him Richard, told me I was in charge. A little backstory on Richard: he was in his 60s and had started the company out of his garage. He ended up buying a huge chunk of land and turned it into an industrial park, all while in his 20s. By now, he was one of the richest guys in the state. He was also the biggest jerk I'd ever met. He treated every employee like garbage, except for me and one other guy. If we dared to talk to each other during work hours, he would scream at us. My promotion kind of financially trapped me. Richard would have no problems talking to me though, and he was the braggy sort of rich guy, while paying us the bare minimum. During our talks, I learned that he cooked his books. You see, the industrial park was owned by an entity that he created, while Spiral was owned by another. He would always make sure that the park entity charged Spiral enough in rent that it looked like the company was barely staying afloat. He also bragged that he'd taken a bunch of industrial waste and buried it on his property at home because it cost so much less. He made my life heck over the next decade, always keeping my pay just high enough that I couldn't afford to leave while treating me and my guys like crap. I ended up with a 95% turnover rate on employees. I am not exaggerating. We ended up having to go to temp agencies, and towards the end, even they refused to send me people. I had to do some careful wording, but my duties ended up swelling to the point where I convinced Richard to let me say I was the plant manager. This right here was huge. I have no degree from college, but I now had a title and the experience. I started to look for a job in earnest, and after 6 months, I found one for a lot more money with benefits. Yeah, Spiral had none. Now, over my time at Spiral, I had seen everyone that gave them notice be told to leave on the spot, and the company that hired me insisted I give them the 2-week notice. So I said I would, but I didn't. At the end of my last day, I sat at my desk and sent an email to the head of OSHA and the state's EPA office, 2 men that I'd gotten to know well. I filled them in on all of the violations that Richard had disclosed. I also sent an email to the state's attorney about the books. I left my keys on my desk with a paper under them that simply read, "I quit." I never found out if the state's attorney went anywhere, but the contact at OSHA let me know that the company ended up with $150,000 in fines for some willful violations, and the guy from the EPA dug up half of Richard's property before he admitted to where he buried the waste. Last I knew, he ended up in jail. I was kind of curious if that's actually considered like cooking the books, because I feel like if that's something that you could get away with, that's such like an easy dumb loophole. There's no way that there's not some kind of accounting for it. People in the comments pointed out he was too dumb to actually even cook his books properly. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is, I was thrown under the bus by my partner of several years. I made sure she bore the consequences of her actions. I was thrown under the bus by the only person I ever truly loved, and she did all of this without feeling the slightest bit remorseful. I guess just as much as you can love someone, you can equally hate them. I don't regret my actions, nor do I think that there must have been another way around this. What is done is done. I, male 22, was backstabbed by one I called my partner. For my story's sake, I don't want to mention her real name, so let's just call her Beatrice. Now, Beatrice and I had known each other since we were both little. Our parents were close friends when they were little, and so we just inevitably became friends. We were the same at the time, and there were a lot of things we both could relate to and with at the time. She made for excellent company while I was growing up, as I never had a sibling. I was an only child. Beatrice, on the other hand, had 3 older siblings, 2 older sisters, and an older brother, of which I wasn't close to any single one of them. Now, while we were growing up, we were literally best of friends. We always went everywhere together, and I couldn't have imagined not going a single day without seeing her. However, soon after, we both got into high school. Everything soon changed. She became a completely different person. The The kind-hearted Beatrice I knew while I was growing was slowly and steadily ceasing to exist. The Beatrice I knew before was always so kind-hearted and respectful. She never for once could stand bullies. All of a sudden, she changed sides and became the head of the bullies. All of this started happening when she made the decision to start moving with the wrong people. Now, I know change is inevitable and all, but I wasn't expecting this much change. At first, I simply thought that this was a phase. However, I would soon come to realize that this wasn't a phase, but rather it was a side of herself that she had developed and come to accept with open arms. When we both were in our second year in high school, she got into trouble with the school authorities, as she was caught with a number of contrabands on school premises. Her parents were furious when they heard the news. They never thought that their baby girl would ever be involved with something like that. At the time, they thought that we both were still as close as we were when we were little, and naturally they involved both my parents. Now, it was at this time that I got a chance to really understand this new persona that she had come to develop, as her parents quite literally forced her over to my place any little chance they got. It was their means of keeping tabs on her, and they thought of me only after they had invited my parents over and found out that I wasn't involved in and with anything that Beatrice was involved with. At first, I knew that she didn't want to be over at my place, but she would soon come to warm up to me again, and we would soon start to have regular conversations. For some time, it was seeming like she was actually returning back to the person I once knew. I had no idea that this was all part of an act she was putting on, which was for her parents actually. After a few months had passed by, she quickly returned back to her old delinquent self. She went back to her clique. Only this time, she thought it was only right that she brought me along. I wasn't comfortable with this decision of hers, and I even thought of fighting it. However, I thought to myself that it was better I was with her, basically to make sure that she doesn't get into as much trouble again. I made the decision to stay with her on my own volition, and till this day, I regret the decision I made that day. A few months went by, and I must say, I was doing a pretty good job at keeping her in check. And in this time, we became even closer with each other than we had ever been. One thing led to another. We both found ourselves in a situation where our true feelings about each other came to light. At the time, I had this profound fondness for her, and there I could feel that she felt the same way about me. I wasted no time in coming out with my feelings, as there didn't seem to be a downside to doing so. Now, coming out about my true feelings to Beatrice almost didn't go as planned, as she surely had reservations. She was worried that the both of us getting into a relationship at the time might threaten the foundation of our long-cherished friendship. Now, she made me understand her worries and the fact that if things do not work out between the both of us in the relationship, it would become hard to maintain our friendship. It was my choice to make her understand what getting into a relationship would entail for the both of us, and what us not working out would mean for our friendship. After a not-so-long talk, she finally gave in. Now, I don't want it to sound like I forced her to do anything. The only thing I did at the time was assure her that no matter how our relationship between the both of us might end, our friendship would always be secure. Little did I know that it was at this time that my bad luck would soon commence. I guess you could say it was still brewing. Now fast forward a bit, it was after we both had graduated from high school. We were, I think, 2 years into our relationship, and things were going pretty okay for the most part. We had loads of arguments and a whole bunch of other things that caused disputes, but thankfully we were able to scale through all of that. Now, in all of this time, I had not the faintest idea what Beatrice had been up to, and I must say, she did a really good job at keeping her actions discreet. This, however, was until the consequences of her actions were upon her. At this time, seeing as we both were together at the time, I bore some of those consequences. Beatrice had apparently returned back to her old ways, basically trading contrabands and some form of a new drug. I can't really remember the name. Now, right after high school, I thought it was only proper that I went for the next degree, and in order to do that, I had to begin the application process to several colleges of my choosing with the hopes that I would get accepted by one. Beatrice, on the other hand, was a little bit more focused on other things. She dubbed it her personal goals. I decided not to pry into her matter as long as she wasn't idle. We got a place together and we lived together for a sum total of 1 year, 8 months. Like I said, in all of this time, I had not the faintest idea what she had been up to, not up until our home was raided by the authorities one day, just as I was in my second year of applying to various colleges and getting no response. They came in abruptly, apprehended the only person they found at home at the time, me. I was seriously confused as I had no idea what they were doing, nor did I know what they were looking for, as they were turning the entire apartment upside down. I just sat there hoping that when they were done, they would release me and give me a detailed and proper explanation as to what was going on. To my surprise, they came out of the bedroom with about 3 bags filled with packets upon packets of drugs. The only drug I could even identify in the bunch was coke. The rest were foreign to me. Immediately, the officers came out with the bag, they took me into their vehicle and straight to their station. I was interrogated and questioned for days. They were apparently trying to find out as much as they could for me. Unfortunately, I knew nothing. I just sat there like an animal to the slaughter. It was at that time that a separate officer came in. He tried to play good cop, bad cop. However, it didn't take him long to realize that I truly had no idea what was going on, and so he brought to bring in the only person I could be linked with, Beatrice. I was finally feeling some form of hope. I thought to myself, at least Beatrice can vouch for me. I should be able to get out of all of this once Beatrice gets here. Nothing could ever prepare me for what was to come. When Beatrice got in, she wore a really sad look. This got my hopes up and through the roof. This was, however, until she actually started talking. She basically told the officers the opposite of what I was expecting. She said I owned everything they found and more. She was trying to make them understand that she was being abused in our relationship, and that this was the reason why she couldn't report whatever it was that I was up to the appropriate authorities. I was shocked beyond belief. Now, deep down, after assessing the whole situation, I discovered that they actually belonged to her, and she only confirmed it after I spoke with her alone, and she said with a straight face, "I know you might not forgive me, but just help me this one time and take one for the team." Her words were like fuel to the boiling flame of anger that I had within me. How could she do this to me? Why was she that brazen? Did she ever love me, or was I just a front for her business? What was I going to do? These were the questions that ran through my mind in that instant. Thankfully, the officer that brought Beatrice in could tell that something was definitely up, and he was not going to let up that easily. He came to me with an offer to serve a specific time that the court would decide on, after which, when I get out, I would come back out and get justice for myself. He explained to me that all he needed was to burst their entire drug operation, and detaining me would do him no good, seeing as I wasn't even involved with whatever they had going on. I had no choice but to take him up on his offer, and thankfully the court decided on only a year and a half for my sentencing and a few extra months on probation. It was a really long year being incarcerated, and surprisingly, Beatrice visited me regularly. Seeing her only angered me all the more, but I knew I had to be patient, as my 1-year sentence would soon come to an end sooner than I thought. Upon my release, Beatrice was waiting for me on the outside, and she was really happy to finally see me. I can't say I felt the same. She apologized and told me everything there was to tell, and I could definitely tell that she was remorseful, but this wasn't going to stop me. We went back home and tried to get things back to the way they were, or so she thought. A few weeks after I'd gotten out, I got in contact with the officer I'd made a deal with, and he gave me instructions on what to do. I was to find out as much as I could about their base of operations. Initially, I thought it would be hard to do, considering Beatrice might not trust me enough to do that. Little did I know that she was all the more willing to do anything to make up for her actions, and it was all almost too easy. She introduced me to her partners and trade associates. I was heavily praised for my loyalty, and I'd become quite popular in their industry. I was disgusted that Beatrice would even associate herself with such people, and this, on its own, steeled my resolve. I didn't have to think about whether or not to turn her and her associates in anymore. I knew that at that point, there was no going back for her. I sent the details of all of my findings to the officer I was reporting to, and he immediately leapt to action, as he first began by apprehending Beatrice right in our home, just as they had done a year ago. The look she had on her face at the time gave me all the satisfaction I could have ever needed. I do not regret my actions, but I do regret not knowing what was happening sooner. Like, I know the tables were completely turned on OP as far as like the power of assumption goes. You know, the partner saying, oh, he was an abuser and it's all his stuff and he's just this evil monster that I'm trying to get rid of, help me. Like, I understand how in OP's situation it feels like there's no other choice than to just accept whatever deal you can get, but it still feels crazy to me that OP went ahead with it and just didn't fight that year-plus sentence. Our next story is A Mother's Instigation, a Daughter's Completion. I've promised my late friend that I wouldn't share the story until at least a year after her death. That time has passed, and this is nothing short of beautiful, cruel, but beautiful. I'm going to switch to a first-person point of view. This is the story as my late friend told me. I was an only child to 2 loving parents. Mom had a difficult pregnancy and an even harder labor. It was so bad that the doctor advised that they never try again. Because he didn't want his wife to die, Dad got a vasectomy that was successful. I was sad that I didn't have any siblings, but I had a happy childhood until I was a young adult. When I was in the middle of college, Mom was diagnosed with stage 4 HGSOC, high-grade serous ovarian cancer. It's the most aggressive form of ovarian cancer, and Mom's older sister and Mom both died from it. We knew her odds weren't good. I don't know what Dad was thinking. I really don't, but he started having an affair with his coworker, a woman just a few years older than me. Coworker started integrating herself into my and Mom's life. She would go shopping for us, keep the house in order, help me with housework, and even sit with Mom when Mom was going through chemo and Dad and I weren't there. And no, I had no clue at all. I just thought it was coworker being kind to a family going through hard times. Mom fought. She fought hard, but the odds just weren't in her favor. One day, I was visiting her in hospice and we were playing Chutes and Ladders. Mom got real quiet and then she told me, "You do know your dad isn't planning to reverse his vasectomy, right?" I was surprised, wondering what she was talking about. "Yeah, I know," I said. "Why?" Mom just looked at me and said, "I think you'd best keep it in mind." We continued playing, and when I left for the night, I kissed her and she said, "You'll be fine on your own." She died that night. I believe she knew she was going to die that night and didn't want to scare me. Once again, coworker was right by our side. She helped us plan the funeral, brought us food, helped out around the house, and slowly started moving her things in. It was like putting a frog in a pot of water and having the temperature raised. It was slow. It was gradual. A year or so later, she had completely moved herself in and was a part of our lives. I don't remember what made me suspicious enough to start digging, but start digging I did. I learned the affair began shortly after Mom's diagnosis. I was sickened, furious, and saddened. I took out my cell, ready to confront Dad and coworker with the knowledge, but something else struck me. See, during one of her visits, coworker mentioned to Mom and me that she wished to have children with her fiancé. Mom knew that the affair was going on, and she trusted me to spill the beans. But I wanted to twist the knife further. As a result, I decided to play the long game. It was a gamble, one that had a good chance of not paying off, but it was one I was willing to take. I kept my mouth shut. I watched as they courted, got engaged, and married 3 years later. I squealed with delight when they announced their engagement to me, wore a proud smile on their wedding day, and made a toast at the reception. I even took extra steps to hide test results from Dad's urologist in such a way that coworker wouldn't find it but Dad would. Believe me, I was internally screaming. I wanted the world to know the way they hurt Mom and me during her darkest hour. I got dangerously close several times, but I said nothing, knowing the payoff would be worth it. Time passed, we played happy family. I got married to my awesome husband and had children. Dad and coworker played doting grandparents, but I knew from the pained look on coworker's face that she was bemoaning her empty nest. Just as I was beginning to give up hope, the day came. Coworker and I had started the tradition of getting together for coffee shortly after Mom's death. We would talk girl things. Again, as I internally screamed, laugh, cry, love, live, that sort of thing. That day, coworker was sad and sullen. I could tell she'd been crying. I asked what was wrong. I couldn't believe my ears when I heard why. She was struggling to get pregnant for years, but assumed it was stress from work. Then her periods started coming fewer and farther between. She decided to go to the doctor and find out why. It turned out she was entering perimenopause and her chances of successfully getting pregnant had dwindled. The doctor told her, in essence, her childbearing years were over. As I crooned sympathetic noises, coworker said, "It doesn't make any sense. We tried so hard to have kids, but I wasn't able to get pregnant. I don't know why." It was then that I knew it was time. "You mean "Dad didn't tell you?" I said. "Didn't tell me what?" she asked. I was fighting every chance to smile as I tried playing the "it's not my right to tell" and "I can't believe he didn't tell you" cards until she practically begged me. I should have won an Oscar for my performance. I told her about the vasectomy and that Dad had no intention of reversing it. "You should have seen, coworker. She completely deflated like a balloon. Her shoulders slumped, she bowed her head, and she sobbed in her hands. I wanted to rejoice. I wanted to rub her face in it. I knew, though, that would make me look like the bad guy, so I hugged her and rubbed her back, telling her Dad was horrible for not telling her, that she deserved a different outcome, and that he completely wasted her time. Again, I was fighting to not smile. When she left, I told her I would always be there for her. But I knew she wasn't going to be a part of my life anymore. Why would she? I was the daughter of the man who betrayed her. Once she had left and I was alone, I wept with joy and relief that it paid off, but also deep sorrow that Mom hadn't been there to see it. That was the last time I saw her talk to coworker. A few weeks later, Dad called me in a fury. Coworker had packed her bags and left, slapping him with divorce papers. She yelled at him for not being honest with her that he had a vasectomy he had no intention of reversing, that he knew she wanted kids and that she had wasted all of her childbearing years, and that he had left it to me to tell her. He then said, "How could you do this to us? We loved you." I then said in a cold tone, "You and Mom did a good job teaching me how to keep secrets." I hung up and that was it. I never spoke to him again either. Last I heard, he and coworker were divorced and everyone shunned him because of his keeping the secret. I know I won't be joining Mom after I die. What I did was cruel. It was horrible. I should have done what Mom wanted and spilled the beans beforehand instead of wasting coworker's youth and childbearing years. Even if she could adopt, she'd probably die before her children were fully grown. Although, it's hard to have compassion and mercy for a woman who integrated herself into my dying mom's life as she was screwing my mom's husband. You know, I don't really agree with OP's notion that they're not going to where their mom went. Even though OP knew the secret and they held it back all that time, it doesn't make them the bad person. The fiance, the partner, the husband that lied and did that to them is honestly kind of disgusting and vile when you think about what that actually entails. It doesn't make OP the jerk for withholding that and allowing the husband the platform to admit it themselves. Our next story is, my cheating, unloving, and abusive mother thought she could ruin my life and that of our family. I made sure she got what she deserved. My mother was cheating on my father while they were still married, and after I found out, she tried to poison my father's mind against me and ruin my life, all because she wanted her secret to remain safe. I made sure that she didn't get away with whatever it was that she was doing. I, male 24, am the only son from both my father and mother. I have 3 other siblings, all of which are girls. My father had been longing for a male child for as long as he could remember. He wanted a male child which would inherit every single thing that he's come to build over the course of his long life. My mother, on the other hand, not like it was her fault for not giving him a male child or anything, couldn't give him what he was looking for. And after giving birth to my 3 older sisters, both my parents were on the brink of giving up. Until I eventually came around. For as long as I can remember, both my parents always showered me with all of the love, care, and affection that they possibly could. My father, although being a very successful businessman managing multiple multinational companies across the globe, was surprisingly always present in my life. He wanted to make sure that he was the perfect father figure he could possibly be, and also be the father that he didn't have while he was growing up. My mother, on the other hand, was quite the opposite. Aside from the general times where my father was present, my mother rarely paid me any attention. I don't know the reason for this growing up, but the one thing I did know for sure was the fact that she obviously couldn't have cared less about me while I was growing up. When I was clocking age 16, my father decided to purchase my very first car for me. He claimed that this was his dream growing up to be able to own and afford a car at that age. I absolutely loved the car he got for me as my birthday gift. My mother, on the other hand, was not so happy, as apparently she had asked my dad for her own new car at the time, even though she already had about 3 cars of her own at her disposal. I can't say for sure what might have happened behind closed doors between my dad and my mom, but the one thing I do know for sure was the fact that she wasn't happy with my dad's decision, and so she decided to take out her anger, frustration, and displeasure on me. She did so at the time by firstly firing my personal help and also the family chef, claiming to my father that I didn't need personal help, and seeing as I was old enough to receive a car, I should be old enough to be able to take care of myself and my things. She also claimed that she was a mother and a wife, and that there was no need for the family chef. It was obvious that her actions were made with me in mind, and of course I was furious. Not like I could have done anything at the time, but I was just furious. The only thing I could use to compensate myself was the fact that I believed, or rather I was so sure, that my father would not take her side. I guess I thought wrong, because somehow she had managed to convince my father, and he went along with whatever it was that she was saying. That was just the first instance of subtle disputes that had happened between myself and my mother while I was growing up, but the most important one of them all, the one that prompted me to share my story, was the most recent, and basically the last one. Now for context, this was right after I'd just gotten into college. My father, seeing as his son was all grown up, decided to focus mainly on his businesses with the hopes that when I was done with getting my degrees, all of what he had worked for would eventually be passed on to me. My mother, well, you'll get to find out what she had been up to. Now, after I'd gotten into the college of my choosing, courtesy of my father, I decided that I didn't want to stay at the school dorms. But my father insisted, and my mother, and surprisingly, my mother was in full support of my father's decision. She was usually always against him, so this just came as a surprise to me. I went along with my father's decision only on the condition that I get to spend some days back home whenever I wanted. And thankfully he agreed. Now everything was going fine and good for quite some time actually. School was great. I was doing really well in classes and I was just getting to know a very special somebody in my life at the time. Now I usually make my trips back home during the weekends because during that time I don't have classes and I can relax during the entire weekend that I'm home. However, one fateful week, I didn't have classes for the entire week, and this was because of a certain school program. I phoned home and found out that my father was not in the country. I knew that it was only my mother, and so I initially didn't want to go. Monday went by, Tuesday, and then Wednesday. If I can remember correctly, it was a Thursday morning when it hit me. It was my home, and there was absolutely no reason for me to not want to go home, nor was there any reason for me to be scared to go home. So I did the only thing on my mind at the time, which was to get on the next flight back home as soon as possible. Well, I should add that another reason why I wanted to go back home at the time was because my eldest sister was coming over to have dinner with the whole family that day, and I didn't want to miss that, as it had been a while since I saw my sister last. Now, upon getting home, well, there's no other way to say this, so I'm just gonna say it as it is. I caught my mom on her matrimonial bed with someone that wasn't my father. Now, I knew that he wasn't my father because obviously I was very much aware that my father was not in the country. And also for the obvious reason that she was embarrassed and in a really awkward situation when I walked in and saw her and this mysterious person together, and also the fact that I recognized said person. He lived a few houses from our house. The situation was one where I really don't wish anyone else finds themselves, to be very honest. She was lost of words and so was I. I immediately left her room, went straight to mine and bolted it as fast as I possibly could. I had a lot to think about, to process and whatnot. I even thought of getting advice from my sister, ergo, bringing her into the picture. But the more I thought about it, the worse it became. While we were having dinner that night, I couldn't bear to handle the look she was giving me. It was really unsettling. I had to leave dinner that night even though I was really hungry. The awkwardness was in the air for quite some time, and when I couldn't handle it anymore, I was on the first flight out of there by the new week. I was honestly just trying my best to move past what had just happened, but it wasn't looking like my mother was. She started acting out of character. She would call at odd hours just to check up on her son, while she was very much aware of the fact that I knew this act of checking up on her son was simply her way of making sure that I wasn't blabbing my mouth to my father or anything. Honestly, at the time, I just wanted to forget about it. But the more she brought it up, the less likely I was to forget it, and so I decided to play a little prank on her. Anytime she called, I would bring up the fact that my father and I spoke at length that day. This would really shoot her anxiety and fear through the roof. And when I clarify that we spoke about something totally irrelevant, she would heave a sigh of relief, after which she would let me have a piece of her mind. This went on for a while and it was quite fun until it wasn't. I guess she had her fill of my pranks and antics. She wanted to make sure word of her acts never got out. So she took the next logical step in ensuring that, which was making sure that no matter what I said, my father was always going to side with her. And what better way to do this by antagonizing me in the eyes of my father? Now, I'm sure it was no easy feat what she did, but she was able to do it anyways, thanks to all the people she was acquainted with and her connections. Well, to cut the long story short, she basically did everything in her power to ensure that I did not graduate without unnecessary problems. At times, I would get unfair grades on courses that I was so sure that I did excellently well in. And other times, I would just get into trouble with some certain professors, of which after I had to struggle to graduate after spending an extra year in school. I found out that all of the lecturers and professors that I seemingly had issues with were friends and acquaintances of my mother. I also found out that she made a huge donation to the faculty. Basically, everything that happened in my faculty before I'd graduated was reeking of her presence. I couldn't believe that she could do something like this to her own biological son. There are not enough words to say to fully express how I truly felt that day. But I would soon come to satisfy this feeling in some way when I heard the news. Apparently, she was going to divorce my father. There was no reason for this, she just felt the need to do so at the time. At this point, after weighing my options and assessing every possible scenario, I knew fully well that the reason she was doing this was simply because she had another person. That is, she was cheating, and also she knew that seeing as I was already done with getting my degrees and certifications, it was only a matter of time before I took everything that was rightfully mine. I guess you could say that she felt threatened, so she resorted to the only way she thought possible. Little did she know that there were other forces at play, and her actions were going to come back and bite her in the behind. Now I could already piece together what her plan was. The only thing that was missing was the means to disrupt it, and coincidentally, the means presented itself right before me. So my father had already pre-installed an in-house surveillance system that he could access remotely in our house, and his reason for this was to keep a keen eye on the housekeepers and basically every other person that was working for him and that had access to our home. I found out about the surveillance system because my father brought it to my attention when he was back home, after my mother had already served him his divorce papers. Now, at this moment, seeing how deep in thought my father was, it suddenly hit me. There was actual evidence of my mother being unfaithful in her marriage with my father, and I was the only one that remembered the date it happened. I thought to myself for a bit as to whether I truly wanted to get involved with this, as I knew that when this whole divorce incident had passed, I wasn't going to have my mother again. Officially, that is. But after remembering all that I'd been through at her hands, it wasn't such a tough decision to make. I told my father all he needed to know in order to make a case for himself and ensure that my mother got not a single penny from him. The court proceedings were long and hard, but thankfully everything went well, and the court ruled in favor of my father. I felt a sense of relief at that time, knowing fully well that I just screwed my mother over and basically ruined all of her plans. On that very day, she made it known that she doesn't want to have anything to do with our family ever again. Myself especially. That was when I knew that I was successful. I'd gotten payback on my mother after all this time. I don't even know if this takes place in the United States, but even in the United States, I know divorce laws and rules and things and how assets get split when a divorce happens are completely different depending on where you live, but I'm still kind of surprised that a relationship of that long separating, that they didn't get anything. But, you know, maybe there still was some kind of deal where they keep the things they already currently had and had gotten from the marriage. His businesses and his money and assets are going to be fine, but like OP mentioned early in the story, she had gotten 3 cars from this guy, so I guess let her have those and walk away. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.